All right, we're back at it with Tennessee contracts with the 2026 updates, walking you through all of these changes in the RF 401 purchase and sale agreement. Now, as a reminder, I am a licensed broker in the state of Tennessee, but I may not be your broker. And so when in doubt, you always want to check with your broker on how to utilize these forms and navigating through the transactions. Now, there are additional form updates that happened this year, and just as a quick recap, here are some of the changes. And this video is going to be covering the changes in the RF 401 purchase and sale agreement along with some correlating forms. So let's get started with the 401 purchase and sale agreement for existing residential properties. Simply placed, you're going to put the buyer and the seller's information and the property that's going to be sold. On line 9, you're including an instrument number. Well, what is an instrument number? This is found on the deed. This instrument number is going to be stamped, and you can find this very specific number in the stamp. Sometimes it's on page 1, sometimes it's on page at the end. Now, this is going to depend on each county to county, so make sure if you're in a county outside of Montgomery, which is where I'm recording this video, that you check with your registrar's office as to where the instrument number is found on their stamping records. Now, these deeds can be found online. You can also contact your favorite title company and they might be able to assist you. When in doubt, check with your broker. A lot of the brokers have access to full titles for the different areas. Now, in this purchase and sale agreement, you have a section that looks very similar to the listing agreement. It reads exactly the same. It says these things are going to convey, meaning they're going to stay or not stay with the property. Everything in paragraph A automatically stays, and so it's important to understand that down in section B, you need to be specific on anything else that's going to convey to the buyer at no additional cost. You do not need to list anything that's already listed in section A. Things such as the range, which is the stove in the kitchen. You also don't need to include a microwave if it's mounted. That's going to come in as built-in kitchen appliances. Furthermore, you may not also need to include the dishwasher if it's affixed to the cabinets. It also is built-in appliances. But if the dishwasher were on wheels and rolled around, or the microwave was maybe on a countertop, or it just floated inside of an island, then in that place, you may want to include that here if the buyer wants it as an additional item to stay at no additional cost. But there might be some things that the seller has disclosed on their listing agreement and or they've disclosed it on their RF 201 property disclosure that is not going to stay with the property. Those items are going to be listed here on C. Check with the listing broker before you proceed with an offer to make sure that you have all this information accurately listed. Now, section D is going to talk about those leased items. In the listing agreement video, we discussed leased items are going to be transferable to the buyer if they assume them, but not all leases are assumable. And if they're not assumable, the seller has to pay it off. So it's very important for the buyer to have that information ahead of time of, is there a transfer fee? Is it assumable? And if not, what's the balance? If the buyer does not wish to assume a leased item, they'll check the box on 33 and list the item that they do not want to assume the lease of. Now, the seller does have to pay any cancellations prior to closing and make sure that those leased items are removed from the property. So it's important for the buyer to understand that although they may not wish to assume those items will be removed in most cases from the property. And in most cases, I say that because sometimes with the security systems, because they're wired through the home, the system will stay, but it just won't be in working order. Now, if there's a propane tank on the property, the fuel, if there's any in the tank, shall have a meter test ran on it, and then have an invoice that gets sent to closing. This invoice is a buyer charge, and there's a credit to the seller. Now, you could say that the seller is going to give this tank, if it's assumed, to the buyer with any propane that's currently in the tank. That's the seller's discretion, and you would notate that in your special stipulations. But if the seller wants to receive compensation for the propane they've already paid in the tank, make sure you get that invoice and make sure the title company or the closing agency receives it so it can end up on the ALTA. Now, the purchase price will be listed here in numbers and also spelled out. 2A is going to go straight into loans. We're strictly talking about loans here, no cash. just loans, aka borrowed money. On 47, you see this LTV. This is called the loan to value. This is how much money is going to be borrowed against the property. So if a veteran is putting 0 down, this would be 100%. If someone is using FHA and they're putting 3.5 down, you would use 96.5. And you have various types of conventional loans that range in all different amounts. So whatever amount they're putting down, the opposing side would be the one that's going to be lended against the property. Meaning, if I put 20% down, this loan to value number will be 80. A buyer can terminate an agreement with written notice via the verification or a written equivalent, and the seller has every right to request supporting documentation why the buyer is trying to terminate under the financial contingency. And we will talk about that with the notification. But down below, you're going to have the type of loan that's going to be utilized to purchase this property. Now, in this other line, you will not utilize this for cash. You will not utilize this for THDA. You can't walk into a bank and say, I'd like to get a THDA loan today. Okay? You could get a THDA backed loan, meaning that there might be an FHA loan that's backed with THDA, or you'll have a VA loan that's backed with THDA. But THDA by itself can't purchase the property. Now, a buyer can apply for a loan with different terms and conditions at any time, but they can't have the terms of this agreement changed. It also cannot increase any cost to the seller. So should the buyer have to change their lender, they would utilize the notification 656 and check off number 8. You'll list the new lender's information and their contact information here. Now in 2A, you have financial contingencies that must be met. Within 3 days, the buyer must make loan application and pay for the credit report. And you might be like, well, Caitlin, they already got a pre-approval. And you're right, they probably did. But a pre-approval is missing 2 things to make full loan application. That's going to be the contract and the address. 14-day notification. And a 14-day notification has 3 things they must do. The first being securing their hazard insurance, which is going to be their homeowner's insurance, telling the lender that they have the intent to proceed and they have the closing funds available that were previously disclosed on their loan estimate, and that they have ordered the appraisal and paid for it. The appraisal doesn't have to be done by the 14th day, it just needs to be ordered and paid for. And the buyer must provide that notice to the seller. And so they do that with this notification. Number 1 simply states that they've applied for the loan and they've paid for the credit report. Number 9 is the checkbox for the insurance, intent to proceed, that they have the money to close, and that they have ordered and paid for the appraisal. Now, there is a section down below that says if the buyer doesn't do these things, they're in default. And well, what happens if they're in default? Well, the seller can give notice to the buyer that puts them on a 2-day notice to comply. And should they not comply within those 2 days, then the seller has the right to terminate this agreement. That verbiage in green is new this year. It used to say the seller's obligation to sell it could be terminated. Now they just have this right to terminate. They don't have to, but they can if they want to. And so this is where that comes in. If it's pertaining to the lender info in the credit report, the seller will send number 20. That triggers 2-day warning to the buyer to comply. If they don't within the 2 days, they will send over 21 that says agreement is hereby terminated. The buyer is in default at this moment, and so all earnest money funds are due to the seller. The next one is going to be for the insurance, the intent to proceed, and the appraisal. Number 28 is sent to trigger the 2-day warning. 29 is issued to terminate the agreement and release the earnest money funds to the seller. Now, 3 just states that the buyer has to pursue their qualification and approval diligently and good faith. That also is going to go into making sure that they get all of their lender documents turned in on time. That's number 4. Number 5 is that this is not contingent upon a lease termination and or the sale of a real property. They cannot use those items as a loan denial unless otherwise stated. And they would state that in the special stipulations that this offer is contingent upon their lease cancellation or it's contingent upon the sale of a home. Number 6 simply states that they're not going to change any material changes to their financing, like they're not going to quit their job, or they're not going to pull out a new line of credit that would affect their debt to income ratio. Don't go buy that boat or that car either. That will affect your financial conditions. All of these items, if they're utilized and the buyer says, hey, I need to terminate, and it's outside of those 4 items, and they've acted in good faith, the lender just says, we can't get you approved any longer. They will issue a lender denial letter, and the buyer will issue the notification with number 7 check that says, hey, I did what I could. I worked in good faith, but I'm unable to obtain the financing, and so I'm exercising my right to terminate and get my this money back. The seller at that point can send over 22 that says, I hear you, but I do want documentation supporting your loan denial. Let's get into the second section of number 2. This is 2B. This is where the financial contingency is waived because we're using cash. Remember, in section A, it's only for borrowed money from a bank. B is going to be for cash. So the buyer at any point in time when using cash can still obtain a loan. They have the right to, but they lose all of their rights under the loan financial contingency in paragraph A. So they can still get a loan, but they can't use any contingencies for a loan contingency to terminate the agreement. And they must furnish and provide all available funds within 5 days. The performance for cash is going to be 5 days. They're going to provide a bank letter, a statement that's redacted, or some type of information that shows the funds are available. What happens if you need more than 5 days? For example, if it's trust money, they might need additional signatures and they need more time to get approval for the funds to be disclosed. So in that case, you would utilize this stipulation block and you would change from 5 days to however many days you're going to need. The bank typically will tell you how many days they need. Everything in green has been added. The word documentation was a replacement of a previous word. And then furthermore, the seller has the right to terminate the agreement should the buyer be in default and they send over that 2-day notice and the buyer not move forward with providing their proof of funds. Okay, they also shall be considered in default and therefore any earnest money is relinquished to the seller. Now the second paragraph is going to talk about the appraisal. When you're using a loan, the lender orders the appraisal. But when you have cash, the buyer has the option to order an appraisal. If they do, they must notify the seller of who the appraisal company is and their contact phone number. Again, if they don't do those things, they get a 2-day warning. The buyer shall be considered in default and the seller's right to move forward is terminated. So here's your notice for this. The buyer will check off number 2 and attach any documentation for their letters that state that they've got the money. And number 3 is going to be for the appraisal. That's where you would list the appraisal company and their phone number. If you don't do that, the seller is going to send you a warning with 23 and then 24 that says you didn't do it in 2 days for those proof of funds. And 25 and 26 is going to be for that appraisal area. Now we do have appraisal contingencies in our agreements. Number 1 simply states that the agreement is not contingent upon the appraised value. Therefore, failure to appraise shall not be the basis of loan denial or termination. In most cases, if you're utilizing a loan, the lender is the only person that can waive the appraisal contingency, and you would need what's called an appraisal waiver. This comes from the lender and often is issued when the borrower is putting a substantial amount of money down. Each lending office is different, so make sure you check with the lender if you could check this box for the consumer or not. Number 2 is going to have an appraisal contingency that says that the property must meet or exceed the value of this purchase price. So if you go under contract, say for $300,000 and the appraisal comes in at $295,000, you have a difference of $5,000 on the table. If the value comes in under, the buyer has to promptly notify the seller, and then they have 3 days to decide if they want to waive the appraisal contingency and pay the cash difference of that $5,000, or do they want to terminate the agreement entirely and they get a refund of their earnest money. In the event that the buyer fails to waive the appraisal contingency or terminate the agreement, the contingency shall be set, and therefore failure to appraise it cannot be utilized as a loan denial. The buyer must come up with the money when we move forward. So it's very important that the buyer complete their notification. Number 4 is the trigger for, hey seller, we didn't come in at value. I'm going to take my 3 days to decide what I want to do. And within those 3 days, they're going to send over the notification with either 5 or 6 checks with their decision on what they'd like to do. Now the seller again gets to decide if they're going to request any supporting documentation. That documentation can be provided by the lender, and it's called a notice of value. Now this agreement has closing expenses that are going to be in the agreement already pre-written for you. There's a lot of information in here and a lot of cost involved for the seller and a lot of cost involved for the buyer. So it's important that you don't change any of the verbiage. And if you do, you need to make sure you include all of these other items. The biggest change here that we have, that's very important, I'm going to move my bubble so you can see it, is on line 142, where we're talking about origination and discount points. Now, discount points are a little bit different than what's called a rate buy down. So it's important that you talk to the lender and you identify, is the borrower doing a rate buy down or are they doing a discount point? One is permanent and one is temporary. So make sure you check with those lenders before you proceed forward. It's important for you to know so you can help negotiate on behalf of the buyer. Now there's 3 expenses under title expenses that are not identified to be paid by the buyer or the seller. It needs to be determined on line 147, who's paying for the title search, who's paying for the mortgagee policy if there's a loan, and or who's paying for the owner's policy. If there is no mortgage, maybe it's cash, then there is no mortgagee policy. So at this point, you're only negotiating for the title search and the owner's policy. But you must state very specifically who's paying what of these items. Now let's talk about these lines below. This is where we get into a lot of mess. This is where we're going to ask for the seller to offer compensation for our expenses. And so here's some things that we found in contracts that shouldn't be here. Okay, the buyer to pay all closing costs. Well, the first thing here is there's no such thing as closing cost in our form anymore. They're all called expenses. So you have seller expenses, buyer expenses, and title expenses. So if the buyer's paying all of their own expenses, great. You don't have to restate it. It's already stated that they have to pay those things. The second one, it looks like somebody copied and pasted, meaning that they put the seller to pay 3.5% of the purchase price towards the buyer's expenses and title expenses as identified herein. And then down below, they listed it very similar again, but they left the blank. So remember, these are legal documents. You need to be very careful what you're placing in these forms. Title expenses, you would just say seller to pay or buyer to pay, and then you would identify who's paying what. And then down below, you would get specific on how these expenses are being paid. Now this one here says all closing costs and prepaids to be paid by the seller to include seller mandatory fees, owner's policy, title expenses, discount points, or rate buy down not to exceed $14,000. Now that sounds great, but there's no such thing as a seller mandatory fee. If there's any non-allowables, those are going to be listed on the FHA VA addendum. You also want to make sure that you're not utilizing the word closing costs. Again, they're called expenses. Down below, you've got seller to pay $9,800 towards buyer's closing costs. Again, utilize the word expenses. And then where it talks about the HVAC system to be paid off by the seller at closing, well, that's the wrong spot to put this. That will go in your special stipulation block. This section right here is strictly for seller expenses, buyer expenses, and title expenses. Now down below it says the buyer to pay the buyer's expenses and the seller to pay the seller's expenses. Again, that's already said. You don't need to write it again. You just leave it blank. Buyer to pay for all their own closing costs. Well, my seller will be happy about that. But again, you don't have to list it. You just leave it blank. Seller to pay up to $13,400 toward buyer closing costs, prepaid discount points, title, etc. There's a few things that happen here. First being the text box of the 13,400. Was this something that was added after the fact, or was this intentional? You want to make sure that's very clear and concise. Moving forward, no such thing as closing costs. They're all expenses. Prepaids, great. But what about all that other stuff? We've only listed a few things. We've removed what's above. Okay, it's being modified, meaning you're getting rid of. So be very, very careful in this area. And we never want to utilize the word etc. That's ambiguous language. It must be very clear and concise as to what the seller is contributing towards. Remember, tons of items are already listed here. When you start typing, you're changing what the agreement already says. So instead, you may want to utilize some clauses that look like this. When in doubt, ask your broker first. Some brokers already have office clauses to help you with this. This would be something like the seller shall pay up to a certain amount towards the buyer's expenses outlined on those lines. Include all those things and pay this amount. You might also have one where the seller shall pay up to a certain amount for the buyer and title expenses outlined on the lines. Or you could flip it and put the money at the end. You could say the seller shall pay towards buyer expenses outlined on those lines not to exceed a certain dollar amount, and so on and so forth. When in doubt, ask your broker. Now, the closing agency for the buyer and seller are going to be listed here. This is going to include the company name, any point of contact, and the phone number. RESPA Section 9, which is federal law, states that no seller of a property can dictate where the buyer closes if the buyer is paying their own owner's insurance policy for the title. Okay, so if the buyer is paying their title owner's insurance policy, then they get to choose where they're closing. But if the seller is making the payment for that owner policy, then they could dictate because they're the ones paying it. So just make sure you're very careful and that you're not in federal violation of RESPA Section 9. Our next section is going to talk about the earnest money. Earnest money is due within a date that is listed in the agreement. Typically, we see around 3 to 5 days for earnest money to be held, but this date is negotiable and it's negotiated through the agreement of the offer. Down below is going to be what happens when the earnest money is not deposited on time. Well, again, you have a performance here. The buyer shall do these things, and they shall do those things and provide notice to the seller. Now, the holder is going to promptly notify the buyer and the seller if the buyer fails to submit the money on time. The buyer then has 1 day to perform and get the money deposited. If they don't, and the buyer does not deliver the funds, the buyer is in default, and the seller has the right to terminate the agreement. So here's your notice. Number 30 is, hey, we're giving you notice. We did not receive the earnest money, and you have 1 day to go ahead and get those funds issued to the holder, whether it's the brokerage or the title company, whoever's identified in the agreement. Now, 32 is, we didn't get it on time, and so the seller's right is to terminate, and they're exercising that right. Otherwise, earnest money is held in escrow all the way until one of these 5 things occur. The first being the closing. And at the closing, it's applied as a credit to the buyer's purchase price, meaning the lender is going to provide what's called a closing disclosure to the buyer, and the agents receive what's called an ALTA. And on this, it'll have a credit for that earnest money on the buyer side of the ALTA. It's in good practice to talk to your buyers about this, not state that they're going to, in quote, get it back at closing. Instead, they're going to receive it as a credit towards any costs that are due at closing. I want you to get out of the habit of saying you're going to get it back at closing, because in the buyer's head, they think that they're going to receive this earnest money as a check, and they're going to physically have those funds returned to them. And in some cases, if all the costs are not covered by the transaction negotiations, then that is going to be a credit to whatever they owe at closing. The second is going to be upon written agreement signed by all parties having interest in those funds. That's called the mutual release agreement. That's the RF 481. C is going to be upon a court order, meaning that you've got an interpleader or there's some type of arbitrator that's been included. E also includes the interpleader, so the courts are involved. And D is going to be upon a reasonable interpretation of the agreement. Typically, that's going to be when the brokers are involved. They interpret the agreement, and then they decide if the funds go to the buyer or the seller, or if the funds will be split between the two parties. Now, earnest money shall not be dispersed prior to 14 days after the deposit, unless there's evidence that the funds have cleared the bank account. So what happens sometimes is a borrower will submit earnest money, say by day 3. Maybe that's at the end of a Friday, and it hasn't been deposited because the bank deposits are closed, or the office is getting ready to close, and maybe it'll be deposited the next day. Well, if the next day is a Saturday or a Sunday and the office is not open, it may not get deposited until Monday. But what happens if the agreement has a situation where the buyer wants to terminate over the weekend? Well, now in this case, the funds can't be distributed back to the buyer until they have shown clearance from the bank account. It has to clear the account, and then it can be cut back to the buyer. So just be very careful with earnest money and make sure that you explain to the buyer, should they have a deposit and then they want to turn around and get the funds right back to utilize for another property, that it does have to clear the bank account before the funds can be distributed back. Now, there's different rules about earnest money and the holding of the earnest money. The Brokers Act says that we have to release the funds within 21 days, but title and escrow companies do not have those same rules. Should there be a dispute and there's no mutual agreement, or there's nothing in the agreement that has a reasonable interpretation that states that the funds should go to either party, in that case, an interpleader would be filed, and then that would go to the courts to dispute the funds. Now, the closing date will go here. This is a drop dead date. It's not on or before. It is on this date. And so if this date happens to fall on a Saturday, Sunday, or federal holiday, you're going to need a closing date amendment, which is the RF 657. Now, you could have a possession where it's the date of deed, meaning that you've gone to closing, both parties have signed, somebody brings the money, somebody brings the keys, and the deed is recorded with the registrar's office. That would be closing as evidence of delivery of the warranty deed on 202. But if the buyer needs to move in early, that would be upon a temporary occupancy agreement called the 626. And if the seller needs to stay post-closing in the house so they can do a move over, you would check that box and you would use the 627. Now, both of those agreements have different stipulations that identify the cost for either party to stay in the property, when the costs are due, and what the terms are. Those agreements are used for 60 days or less. Now, there could be prorations that are going to be due, and in the event there's a change or reassessment of the taxes for the calendar year, both parties understand that they must pay for that recalculation share. They'll be contacted if there is something that's due. And for Montgomery County, the tax assessment occurs every 5 years, and the next reappraisal will be in 2029. For any other county, you can check the Controller of Treasury for Tennessee. Right here, I've got this QR code. It will take you straight to it. That's going to jump into the property assessments page, and from there, you can select the county that you're interested in finding out more information on. Now, you do have this Greenbelt section listed here. Now, the Greenbelt is going to be for properties with a minimum of 15 acres, or it otherwise qualifies to be in the Greenbelt. It's important for the buyer to understand that if they choose to keep the property in the Greenbelt, they must make application to keep it in the Greenbelt. It's their job to do so. They need to contact the assessor's office. They can do so at their local assessor. I put Montgomery counties at the top, but if you're in a different county, you can go to the Controller of Treasury site, and I've linked the Greenbelt section here. It's going to take you to the application and the manual for Greenbelt. Now, if the buyer does not intend to maintain it in the Greenbelt, the seller needs to know, because there might be rollback taxes that have to be paid by the seller at the time of closing. So that could be a substantial cost that they need to be aware of ahead of time. A special assessment might be levied against a property, and these assessments must be paid by the seller prior to closing unless it's otherwise stated. And this could occur in areas that are outside of an HOA. always check ahead of time to see if there's any assessments that need to be paid. So that way you can identify if the buyer is willing to pay it. If not, the seller needs to make sure that they have the bill paid prior to close. Now, there could be a warranty on the property, and the seller, at the option of the buyer and the buyer paying for it, can transfer those warranties to the buyer. These are outside those buyer's expenses. So it's very important to understand that if you've already asked for some concessions for the buyer expenses and the title expenses, and you want the seller to also pay these transfer fees, those need to be identified in the special stipulation. You'd be asking for concessions for the expenses plus these warranty transfers. Now, an association also has transfer fees that are very important for you to understand. Those transfer fees are due outside of those buyer expenses as well. So they too, if you want the seller to contribute costs to those, need to be identified on the special stipulation block. There's also a section called capital expenditures. This typically is identified by the listing agent ahead of time, and that is something that the buyer is responsible to pay in advance at closing. Now, during this entire process, the title company is doing a title search to make sure that the property is free and clear of any encumbrances, judgments, liens, and other issues that would cause the title to not be good and marketable. If there's a defect found, the buyer can notify the seller. Should the buyer and the seller agree to have a mutual agreement to extend to allow them to remedy this title defect, then the extension is going to be on a closing date amendment, RF 657. But should this buyer decide to terminate, they would utilize number 11, that they want to go ahead and terminate the agreement and hereby request for their earnest money funds back. Now, B was updated in 23. It was rewritten in 25. This is the area that's talking about those prohibited foreign parties from purchasing property in the state of Tennessee. So make sure that those people and all people are checking the Tennessee Code Annotate to see if they're listed in this category of people who are not allowed to purchase under the current statute. Now, the name of the deed is going to be listed here. And you want to make sure that you're using the full legal names of any person or entity that shall be listed on the deed. This could be an LLC, it could be a trust, it could be two non-marital parties. There's lots of different ways to have ownership in the state of Tennessee, and the deed needs to be identified herein. D talks about an association lien payoff. Should the property owner not pay their association fees, then they will have what's called a lien or an estoppel letter. There might also be a statement of account that's issued, and all of those fees must be paid no later than 7 days before closing in order for the property to transfer. This section here in 6 used to be on the FHA VA addendum, but it's been moved over here for the last couple of years, and it states that should public water and public sewer be made available and it's accessible, that the property must be connected to those areas if the lender requires it. Now, the lender may not require it, but if they do, the seller and the buyer are going to have 5 days to come to a resolution as to who is going to pay for those connections. If the buyer and the seller do not reach a mutual agreement, then the agreement is hereby terminated and the buyer receives their earnest money funds. So to send that notice, you would use the 656 and you'll check off number 19, which is your other block. And then you'll just explain that the lender is requiring for whatever to be connected, whether it's public water or public sewer, and that you're requesting for the seller to make those accommodations. 7 is going to talk about properties that might have lead-based paint. If it does apply, the property was built prior to 1978, then you would utilize the lead-based paint disclosure, which is the RF 209. It looks like this. The 209 is it triggered when the property is built before 1978. The buyer is going to sign off on a little initial here on D. Then they're going to check a box. Either they want to have the property checked for this lead-based paint, or they're going to waive their opportunity to conduct such inspection. The backside of this form had a slight change when the EPA updated their form, and the backside on the upper part has 2 check boxes and 2 initial blocks. This is for the agent. Whichever agent provides this disclosure to the seller is the agent that's going to check off their box and initial next to it. So if the listing agent provides this document to the seller to be filled out, they would check the box and sign next to the seller. And if the buyer's agent is the one who initiated the form, then they would check their appropriate box and initial next to it. So let's talk about these inspections. Buyers can conduct their own inspection. I'm not talking about their dad. No, the buyer themselves can do their own inspection, or they can hire a licensed home inspector. The seller must have all utility service and any pool, spa, or similar items to be operational. But it's in best practice to talk to the buyer about winterization of those products, because if a pool or a hot tub is winterized and they want to have it inspected, they're going to be responsible and they need seller's approval to bring the pool or this hot tub back to life, and then they're going to have to winterize it again. So those are some costs, and all costs for inspections are the buyer's cost. Furthermore, the buyer waives any objections that deal with cosmetics, and that they are not going to ask for any building and code requests. Now, home inspectors are there to do a home inspection, which is a visual analysis of the property and their professional opinion. There are some components that they're not allowed to discuss unless they have a license for those items. You can find additional information about home inspections and what they can and can't do found here on 626302. If a property has a septic or a well, the buyer may ask the seller to provide a letter for either one. These are going to be at the seller's expense. But if they don't request that in the special stipulation, these inspections are also a buyer's inspection and a buyer's cost. The RF-208 subsurface sewage disposal system permit disclosure is only triggered and required by new construction properties. So if this was an existing home, the 208 may not be provided by the listing agent. Some agents do have their seller fill it out, and they provide all of the data that they have found here on the file search. But it's not required for existing properties, and so it's in good practice for a buyer broker to go ahead and assist the consumer with providing this so they can find all the information that they'd like about septic tanks. Now, the buyer and or their representatives can have the right to enter the property during normal business hours for the purpose of making these inspections or these tests. They do need to be approved by the seller. And again, through normal business hours. This is to perform that visual analysis. All inspections, again, are a buyer's cost. That includes the wood destroying insect inspection report, or as we call it, the termite letter. Now, veteran borrowers used to have the termite letter as a non-allowable, but as of June of 22, the VA updated its regulations, and this is now a buyer's expense. The other change that came a few years ago was that the request for treatment and any repair of damage is now all to be negotiated through the repair resolution period. Previously, treatment was going to be required by the seller, and the damage was then negotiated. Now, treatment and any damage are to all be negotiated during the resolution. So let's talk about these inspection and resolution periods. The first being the inspection period. You're going to have an inspection completed within a certain number of days. This is all inspections, not just the home inspection. So if your consumer buyer is looking to have the roof inspected or things that we know take a little bit longer to get somebody out to identify if there's a problem or not, you might want to expand this number out just a little bit further to allow all inspectors to come and do their due diligence on the home. If the buyer misses their deadline and does not perform with one of the items listed below, the buyer does not get to walk or negotiate. They accept the property as is and they move forward, and they cannot terminate based upon the inspection contingency. So let's avoid that. The first being, during your inspection contingency timeline, the buyer can, in good faith, do all their inspections and notify the seller with an RF-656 number 12 that simply states, I no longer want to purchase this property, and here's my list of objections on the property as to why I'm not moving forward. They do not submit the home inspection report. They don't need to include any of the pictures from the report. Simply list those objections on the RF-656 number 12, and turn that into the listing broker. Number 2 says that the buyer can accept the property as is and move forward. The seller has no obligation to any repairs. And number 3 is going to be that written list of items that they want to negotiate. This is what we call the repair proposal. This is found on the RF 654. So here's where they're going to notify. Number 12 says, I'm out. Here's my list of specified objections. 13 says, you know what? As is. And let's keep moving forward. And 14 states that at any point in time during the inspection period, they elect, we've changed our mind. We don't want to do a home inspection. We're good to move forward. They're going to waive the inspections, but they still get to do a final inspection. That box is checked here on number 14. So let's talk about this proposal. The repair proposal is for the buyer to send over things that need to be repaired or replaced. We're not asking the seller to do additional inspections. If the buyer needs more inspections to come to a decision on items that need to be repaired or replaced, they should ask for an amendment to the purchase and sale agreement extending the inspection period. So we're talking about repair or replace items, and they will be listed here. Things like, number 1, secure the loose toilet in the primary bathroom. Number 2, loose handrail at front door to be secured. Number 3, replace broken window in bedroom number 2. You're going to just identify in a list format all of the things that the seller is being requested to replace or repair. And then down below on line 29, you're going to see what's called a repair completion deadline. This is a number of days prior to closing that these repairs must be completed. This date is different than the final walk. During this resolution period, you're going to have a number of days for the buyer and the seller to go back and negotiate these repairs on this proposal. They will use proposal number 1, have a counter proposal number 2, should they need one, and go back and forth until they have a mutual agreement. They must act in good faith together during this entire resolution period. And at the end of the resolution period, if there is no agreement to the negotiated items, then this agreement is automatically terminated. Okay? So they must come to an agreement, and they will do that in one of 2 ways. If the buyer and the seller agree on the items during the repair proposal negotiation, the agreed upon items will end up on a repair amendment. That's the RF 655. The buyer at any point in time can say, you know what, I don't want to go back and forth anymore. We'll just accept it as is. That is the notification 656, number 13. And if they need more time, maybe they need to get contractors out to give some pricing for this, they will send over a 653 amendment to the purchase and sale agreement to extend the resolution period. But should they move forward with a repair amendment, this is where all of the items that they're agreeing to make part of the agreement gets placed here. And again, that repair completion deadline is going to be listed here. Remember, this is different than the final walk. This is also a drop-dead performance date, meaning when it lands on that day, it is due that day. The next section of this area talks about what we previously referred to as a pass-fail inspection. And so the buyer could waive the resolution period and say, I would like to have the right to still do the inspection, but I'm telling you, seller, now, I'm going to either accept it or I'm going to terminate. That's what we would utilize a pass-fail inspection contingency for. You no longer have to place those in your contingency block. Simply check this box that just says, I'm either going to move forward or I'm not. We're not going to negotiate through a resolution period. Now, this next block says I'm not going to do any inspections. This is different. This is a waiver of all inspections. They're waiving all inspections. So when you have an as-is property that's being disclosed as this is as-is, the buyers can still do an inspection, but they need to understand that there's no resolution. They can still terminate the agreement, just like a normal buyer. Just what they're doing is a pass-fail. They're going to check the box that says we elect to still do the inspection, but we understand that there is going to be no resolution. Let's talk about this repair completion deadline for just a moment. That's in the purchase and sale agreement. If the completion of repair deadline is not established on the RF655 repair amendment, then the buyer is going to utilize their final inspection to determine that all repairs and replacements are completed. If those repairs are not completed, what happens? Well, it states that the seller is going to be considered in default, and the buyer has the right to terminate with the notification form, and upon the termination, the earnest money is due back to the buyer. That also applies for the final inspection section. If the buyer shows up to the final and there wasn't a repair completion deadline established, the final walk would be that date, and the buyer at that time can send notification with number 17 check that says, I terminate, you failed to have those repairs completed, and thereby I'm sending you notification of this termination and for my funds to be released. So it's very important as a listing agent to walk the seller through to make sure that they're not missing those deadlines. When the buyer gets ready to do a final walk, they will supply the seller with what's called the RF660. That's the final inspection form. And this is going to outline one of three things. The first being that they've waived the final walk and they didn't want to do one. The second is they did the final walk and everything is agreeable in like manner of when they offered or better. And number three is going to be that they walk the property and there are still certain things that are not yet completed. They still want to move towards closing, but they're putting the seller on notice that those items are not done. Now, the buyer has additional due diligence options. If they want to utilize any of these items, they need to place them in the special stipulation block. Things like a survey, flood insurance, making sure that the property is insurable, that the water supply and the waste disposal, if there's septic or there's a well, maybe some special things done with those. All of those items get listed in the additional contract language. The buyer also understands that the broker is not responsible for any of the following items and that the brokerage might be compensated through an agreement, a separate agreement, which we're utilizing as the listing agreement, or maybe a buyer's representation agreement. Everybody understands that the party agrees the brokers involved in the transaction may receive compensation for their services. What happens if somebody's in default? Well, it's all right here. It says that if the buyer's in default, the seller may elect to sue. And if the seller's in default, the buyer may elect to sue. In either case, in the event that the party is exercising their right to terminate because of the default, the terminating party retains the right to pursue any and all legal rights and their remedies against the default party. Right? There's also compensation that is involved in this situation. So just know that if this is going to come up, you need to get your broker involved. This next section is about home protection plan. Maybe the seller didn't offer it at the time of the listing offer. So the buyer's going to ask for it here. Who's going to pay for it? How much is it? What's the name of the warranty company? And which real estate firm is going to order the plan? Now remember, agents, you are not a party to this agreement, and so you would not list your name here. Right? You would not put it here that the agent to pay because you're not a part of this agreement. So either the seller or the buyer is going to pay, the invoice is going to be invoiced. If it's coming from your compensation, you let the title company know that it needs to be on the seller side of the invoices and that your commission needs to be reduced by the amount of that protection plan. Before you do that, you need to have a conversation with your broker to make sure that you're allowed to deviate the commissions. Now, 16 was added last year. This is going to be talking about assignability of the property. The buyer must provide notice and have written consent from the seller to assign the property. There is a new special stipulation on the RF707 that was added this year. It's number 26. It's talking about wholesaling disclosures. There's a whole paragraph. Before you step into this zone, you need to check with your broker to ensure that you're able to do this. And if you aren't, the attorney needs to be involved. 17, buyers and sellers bind the agreement between each other. The agents just simply start the timer with their acknowledgement of receipt. So once the buyer and the seller have come to a mutual agreement and there's mutual acceptance and it's accepted, they are now legally bound to each other. The agents, we have a signature block called the acknowledgement of receipt that is the timer starter. Either agent can sign the acknowledgement of receipt. Now you have some additional contract language that is going to follow here. The most important you need to focus on is that time is of the essence, meaning get going. And so you have this timeline and performance date tracker to keep you on track. This year there was a slight update to the 701. You're going to find that on line 14, where we have added a line for received earnest money on this day. The deposited was there, but now there's a line for received. Let's get into the definition of days and talk about terminology. This contract is based upon calendar days ending at 11:59 p.m. local time, determined by the location of the property. Now, these 4 items are going to be dead dates: your closing, date of possession, completion of repairs, and the offer expiration. When it lands on that day, it is that day. It's due by 11:59 of that day. Even if it's on a Saturday, even if it's on a Sunday, even if it's on a federal holiday. One of these 4 performance deadlines, they're due on that date. Now, if it occurs on a Saturday, Sunday, or federal holiday, and it's not one of those 4 days, and it's another performance date like earnest money, inspections, repair resolution, all of those are going to move to the next business day. There are 11 federal holidays pursuant to this code. These are your 11 holidays. We got quite a few here. And then in calculating any period of this agreement, the commencement date shall be the following the initial date. So if the acknowledgement of receipt is today, tomorrow is day 1. So let's have a quick little quiz here. We know this is January, and the 1st and the 15th are federal holidays. Let's say that the binding agreement date is going to be the 10th. If the earnest money was due in 5 days, when is it actually due? If you said the 15th, you're wrong. The reason for that is earnest money is not a drop dead date. So you would begin your commencement on the 11th, that's day 1, 12, 13, 14, 15th is day 5. Because it's a federal holiday and it's a rolling date, you'll roll it to the next business day, which is Tuesday the 16th. Now let's try the inspection period. 10 days from the binding agreement date. All right, did you say Saturday the 20th? That's wrong too. Because the inspection period is going to not be a drop dead date, you're going to roll this to the next business day, which is Monday the 22nd. This section here just explains that should the buyer or the seller have some clerical errors that need to be corrected, that they're going to go ahead and take care of that if requested after closing. You have a section for notice. There's 5 notices for the state of Tennessee. Texting is not a form of notice, so you want to make sure that you put them in one of the other notice sections. And should the property have a loss that exceeds 10% of the purchase price prior to the closing, the seller or the buyer may elect to terminate the agreement. This would be if there's a disaster or an accident that occurs in the house and there is a loss of property that exceeds 10% of the purchase price. You have additional equal housing, perfect housing. You also have severability included, some additional language for legal, and then you have obligations here. These seller obligations are going to talk about the 6 items that are found on your property disclosures. These are in the 200 series of your forms library. The seller must disclose and give disclosure on these 6 items. You have several methods of execution as to how these can be transmitted back and forth. Fax copies and e-signatures are all allowable. In section 20, you have your exhibits and addenda. Just remember your statute of limitations is 3 years in Tennessee, and if the form does not start with a 5 or a 6, it doesn't belong here. So here's your 500 series, and here's your 600 series. You have a new form that's been added to your 600 series. This is going to be the compensation addendum amendment. But warning, your broker will decide if you're going to utilize this form, and if so, how you'll use it with your transactions. So check with them first. This is the new form. At the time of the offer, it's considered an addendum. And once you have a bound agreement and there needs to be changes to compensation, that would be utilized as an amendment. This is going to state that the seller shall pay a certain dollar amount or percent of the purchase price, and or the buyer is going to pay. Now remember, the buyer broker already has an agreement with their agent that states that the buyer's on the hook for the charge. And the second part of it is that the agent is going to negotiate on behalf of the buyer to get the seller to cover the fee. But if the seller doesn't cover the fee in its entirety, there's a difference on the table, and the buyer is responsible for the difference. So this form could state that the seller is to pay some, the buyer is to pay the balance, and everybody signs. Or, in best case, the seller agrees to pay all of it. And when the seller does not agree to pay all of it, then the buyer is responsible for all of it. You would check the applicable boxes and move forward. Now, the special stipulations is not where you get to be Shakespeare, so make sure you're checking with your broker first and that you're utilizing your RF 707 additional contract language to put anything extra in here that might need to be included. So let's talk about this 707. This had a few updates this year. It looks like this, and you have to remember that handwritten provisions prevail in an agreement. So if you're not sure if you should be putting it there or it's not worded right, check with your broker first. Never include phrases TBD, NA, actual cost or negotiable, and or etc. Never. If you don't have enough room on your special stipulations agreement, you can go ahead and utilize the addendum. This is the RF 621. This is the addendum that adds to the purchase and sale agreement prior to an agreement being signed. This clause here is number 24. This is the system clause that was utilized over the last year and a half to request for buyer broker compensation to be paid on behalf of the seller. Brokers get to determine if their agents are going to continue utilizing this one sentence or if they want to utilize the addendum amendment, which is the 620 that was added this year. Check with your broker first if you need to use the clause or if you're using the addendum amendment. Secondly, on the 707, the new change for number 25 that was added this year is for open houses that are allowable to have conducted by outside brokerage agents. The listing agreement states already that all agents within this firm are allowed to host the open house. But sometimes there might be an agent from an outside firm that would like to sit in the open house, and so the broker can allow that. And this clause would be added to your RF 101 listing agreement. Now, the buyer can withdraw their offer at any point in time. They would utilize the RF 656 notification number 16. A seller can also withdraw their counteroffer at any time. So make sure you put a date here because remember, the offer acceptance here is also a drop dead date. There's a time and a date for it to end. No blanks, and any blank that is listed shall be deemed as 0 or not applicable. And if a box needs to be checked, it must be checked in order for it to be part of the agreement. Your buyer will sign here. The seller will give their reply. If they're going to counter offer, there will be a counter offer sent over and they will negotiate on there. The buyer and the seller also understand that the seller, once they review it, will check off the rejected box if the agreement is not agreeable and they don't want to counter offer. This lets the buyer know their offer was seen. This is part of the code of ethics, so make sure you check out the rules on what that means. Now down below is your timer starter. Remember, once the buyer and the seller sign an acceptance, all we, the agents, do is acknowledge the receipt of the acceptance and we start the timer. And don't forget to fill in this information on the bottom. This is for your lender and your title companies. Don't be the jerk and leave it blank. So you can import from the MLS by an MLS data import into Transaction Desk and Transact, and or you can start in Transaction Desk and import the data that way as well. You can go one of two ways. That's it for this form. I look forward to seeing you and all your contracts in 2026.